Oh, well, I especially want to get this class on YouTube so that you have a record of this one. This is one of my favorite classes because most people don't understand how do we prove literature, especially in antiquity. But this is true of all literature. This is true of all historical artifacts. So, you know, this is probably the most important point that you could learn in a class like this that you probably didn't learn when you were in college or high school or wherever. I'll try and point out that, well, it'll become obvious quite right away. Now, somebody asked about where the word Levant came from, and I said I didn't know last week, and I found out. Levant is a French word. It means the rising sun. And so it comes from an Arabic word which they use to describe that area in the Mediterranean where the sun rose, that is in the east. So Levant, that's what it means. L'Avant, I think, something like that. Okay, I mess with French a little bit, but I'm not a French scholar, so I don't know. But in any case, you can find these slides on ldalford.com or lionelalford.com. You can also find links to the websites for YouTube where you can find these videos. So the one that I'm doing right now, and also past other videos. I'm teaching a class in the Matthew right at the moment, and I'm up to part 2. So in any case, let's look at this. We are talking about the Gospels as Greek literature, because they're Greek literature, right? Mm-hmm. And so we're looking at the literary context, and, you know, I keep telling you that we'll talk more about this next week, but specifically, they're the basis of modern literature. C.S. Lewis wrote a lot about this. There's other authors who've written about this, but we'll talk more about that specifically. The Gospels is history. We already looked at the history last week, and you know, there's I tried to cover 400 years in an hour. You know, usually what is that? That's a class that's about you know, at least a semester long. So you know, you got some of the history, and I'll keep giving the history. The history is the really critical part. The cultural context, that was the very first class, and we'll keep talking about cultural context. You can never get away from the cultural context because they're Greek, written by Hebrew people from a Hebraic background. And that is the basis for Western civilization. That is our understanding of it. And we'll see how that fits together too. It's interesting that all this stuff came out of Greece, but you knew that, right? You said Western Civ. The New Testament in terms of both history and literature, and that's the whole point. So, we're up to the historical veracity of the Gospels. The point of historical veracity is, look, if I were to talk about a document in antiquity, in other words, a historical document, well, let's say it's not even an antiquity. Let's say it's a modern document. Well, don't you need to prove that it's reliable, that you can trust it, that it's good history, that it's good culture, that it's whatever? I mean, even today, for example, who's that kitty lady who writes all the biographies? Does anyone believe that she's writing truth? I mean, let's have a little proof text here, right? We'll talk about witnesses and eyewitnesses and etc. But you know, in the ancient world, we have a paucity of documents. There's not a lot of them. In the modern world, we have lots of documents. We may have more problem in the modern world figuring out what's truth and falsehood than they did in the ancient world, because there's so few of them. I think that is the true problem. Now, we do have a lot of neat stuff that we didn't have in this period. We'll talk about those too. But in any case, there is a method called the legal historical method that you use to apply to all evidence, any evidence in the world period. And I'll talk about that. We have bibliographical tests, we have historical proofs, and we'll talk about all those. Now, I couldn't start without some Greek words. I'm going to just go really quickly through the Greek words of the day. Aletheia, amen, aletheos, and aletheis. Now, the reason I give you these words is because Greek does not have a word for truth. There is no word in Greek for truth. You could have guessed this because I've told you Greek is a geometric language. Because it's a geometric language, remember geometry. Could you prove a truth in geometry? No, you can't. You can only prove a not false or a not true. You can prove something is not true in geometry, in logic. But you can never prove a truth. This is an important thing. Did they teach you this? You know it from geometry, right? Did your geometry teacher ever tell you that this is true of all logic? In logic, you can't prove a truth, but you can prove a not truth. It's interesting that in Greek, aletheia, the word that we translate truth, means not false. Not false. A is the negative. Whenever you've seen A, just generally, well, there's a few other prefixes in Greek, but A means not. So not false means true. On the other hand, amen is a borrowed word. It's borrowed from Hebrew. Amen doesn't mean truth either. It means I agree with you. So we translate these words in the Greek, in the New Testament documents, both as truth. Sometimes we translate amen as verily, verily, sometimes as amen. But you notice I don't have a word for truth in Greek. And this is important. It points out the construct of the language. It points out that it's a geometrically based language. It also points out the concreteness of Greek. Now, modern Greek, I don't know if there's a modern Greek word for truth or it has a borrowed word, but it probably did. Remember, the Greek is the top of the world in this period. It's the word, it's the language spoken by all the world. Now, these other ones, apatheia, disbelief, whatever. I just put these in as comparisons, but I'm going to skip over them because there's more important things to talk about. Aletheos, we translate generally, truly, truly I say to you, surely, surely I say to you. But you notice, aletheos, it's the same word. It's not false. Alethes, same. In any case, how do you prove history? How do you prove history? How do you know what is truth? Because that's what we're talking. We have a word in English for truth. We fool ourselves into believing that we can prove truth. We can prove it not false. Let's see if we can prove it not false. So how do we know that anything in history happened? How can we know that? What's the proof? Let's pick somebody in antiquity. Let's pick, Alexander the Great or Caesar. How about somebody closer? Let's pick someone like Lincoln. How do you know Abraham Lincoln lived? How do you know he was around even? Well, that's what this idea of proving history. I always say this, I like to point this out, but in antiquity, there's more proof for the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ in existence of any other person in antiquity. Period. That. There's more proof for this than Caesar, Alexander the Great, Socrates, Plato. Period. So, how do you prove history? You know what? Immediately, the first thing you do when somebody says prove, they trot out the scientific method, right? Use a scientific method. The problem is that I can only use the scientific method for one type of proof. Are you guys familiar with the scientific method? You've heard about it before, right? Everybody's trained in the scientific method. Isn't that interesting? In a scientific method, what has to be true for it to work?
It has to work every time.
It has to work every time. So, for example, if, let's say I took a golf ball, or if I took my controller and I dropped it, every time I dropped it from the same height, I should be able to measure the same force, the same velocity, the same accelerations, the same everything, right, when it hits the ground. And hopefully it won't break. So, can I repeat historical events? Historical events aren't repeatable. Matter of fact, well, luckily I got a video of it, but I can't repeat exactly what I did. I mean, unless I put on a video and back it up like you do on cartoons or whatever, right? History does not ever repeat itself. As a matter of fact, in the scientific method, no matter how perfect a fixture I make to hold this before I drop it, will this drop exactly the same way every time?
No, probably not.
It can't. There's too many variables. That's exactly right. There's too many variables in the real world. So the scientific method, by being repeatable, what do we do to prove it? We repeat it many times, right? Over and over and over again, right? That's what I have to do in my work. You know, statistical correlations and, statistics really do work. Otherwise, airplanes wouldn't fly. but, you know, they don't lie. So in any case, in the scientific method, you can only use it for repeatable events. So can I use a scientific method for history? Is your question?
I agree with you, but the variables that you speak of, if you're willing to go to a lot of expense, you can eliminate many of those variables and then see if gravity is still working.
You can only eliminate them to a plus or minus what we call a sigma of deviation. But you always still have a measurable deviation. Well, you may not have even a measurable deviation, but you know you have a deviation. Right? That's the problem. In my work, for example, in flight test, we go land an airplane and we're supposed to land it in the same point every time, plus or minus 100 feet. Well, how well does that work? Don't happen. But we're looking for a statistical correlation. And the problem is that even if we had a computer doing it, you know, the computer would be off what, millimeters? How about atoms? How about molecules? So I don't disagree with you. We try to get rid of all the statistical variances.
Minimize them. I didn't say get rid of them.
We minimize them to the max extent possible. But, you know, there's even more to this, but that's okay. That's a great point, and I don't disagree. But remember, what I'm trying to show you is this. If I'm doing the scientific method, it has to be repeatable, right? Even if I get rid of my variation, I have to, or reduce it. I have to have something that's repeatable. So is any history provable using the scientific method? You can't use the scientific method to prove anything in history. Now, for example, can you prove the beginning of the world with scientific method?
No.
Well, unless it happened a bunch of times, all right? I can't even prove that you ate lunch yesterday using the scientific method. You might cut open your stomach. Well, what if you ate it at dinner, or, you know what I'm saying? So, how do we prove history? How do we prove for non-repeatable events? We use what's called the legal historical method. The legal historical method is also called the evidence witness method. We use oral testimony, written information, and exhibits. Now, everybody is familiar with the legal historical method. You just may not have ever heard it called this before. You may have heard it called the evidence witness method. Where do we use this? All the time in our culture and society, and everywhere else in the world for that matter.
In the courts.
In the courtroom. That's right. This is used in the courts all the time. Matter of fact, you use it all the time. You just haven't thought about it. When your kids knocked over the vase and busted it, what's the first thing you did? Where were you? What were you doing? Your fingerprints are on that vase, right?
Not me.
Huh? Not me, that's right. The legal historical method, it's obvious to us, right? Why aren't we teaching people about this method? I'll show you why we're not teaching people about this method. This is used all the time. We put people to death based on this. We put people in prison for their whole lives based on this idea. We give you tickets and, you know, punish you in judicial ways using this method. We also use it to prove history. That's the point. There is another method. The scientific method was invented by the Greeks. I talked about this a little bit last week, remember? The Greeks invented the scientific method. Aristotle it's attributed mainly to Aristotle, but there's a lot of other Greek philosophers. The legal historical method invented by Theodocles and Herodotus. They're the main guys that we remember in history as creating this idea. The Greeks invented this too. By the way, almost 500 years or so earlier than the scientific method. There's another method called logic. Logic is used to prove things that do not exist in the real world, like mathematics. Mathematics, and I can't tell you exactly why mathematics, that would take me an hour, is not true in the real world. But, well, I guess I'll try. I'll give you a quick try. You know, you talk about adding apples and oranges.